The rain beat down in relentless sheets, drumming against the windows of the old house with a ferocity that seemed almost sentient. Melanie sat alone in the dimly lit living room, wrapped in a thick blanket as the storm outside raged on. The old house creaked and groaned, its ancient bones protesting against the howling wind. She was grateful for the fire crackling in the hearth, its warmth and light a small comfort against the oppressive darkness and the eerie sounds of the storm. Melanie had inherited the house from her great-aunt Edna, a reclusive woman who had lived alone for decades. The house, a Victorian relic, stood at the edge of the woods on the outskirts of town. It was a beautiful but eerie place, with its tall, narrow windows, ornate woodwork, and the faint smell of dust and age that permeated every room. Despite its isolation and the whispered rumors about its haunted past, Melanie had decided to move in and start a new life away from the bustle of the city. She had always been fascinated by the supernatural, drawn to the unknown and the mysterious. Her friends had warned her about the house, telling her tales of ghostly apparitions, strange noises, and unexplained occurrences. But Melanie had brushed off their concerns, attributing the stories to overactive imaginations and local folklore. Now, as she sat alone on this stormy night, she couldn't help but feel a prickle of unease. The firelight cast flickering shadows on the walls, and the wind outside seemed to carry whispers, indistinct and haunting. Melanie tried to shake off the feeling of dread, telling herself that it was just the storm and the old house playing tricks on her mind. She picked up the book she had been reading, hoping to lose herself in its pages and forget about the unsettling atmosphere. But as the night wore on, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. She could sense a presence, something just beyond the edge of her awareness. She glanced around the room, her eyes searching the dark corners and the spaces between the furniture. Nothing seemed out of place, but the sensation persisted, gnawing at her nerves. With a sigh, Melanie closed the book and decided to make herself a cup of tea. She needed something to calm her nerves, to push away the creeping fear. As she walked to the kitchen, she passed by the large ornate mirror that hung in the hallway. She caught a glimpse of her reflection and froze. For a brief moment, she thought she saw someone standing behind her, a shadowy figure with hollow eyes. Her heart pounded in her chest as she spun around, but the hallway was empty. The shadows danced on the walls, but there was no one there. Melanie took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. "It's just your imagination," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The storm is making you jumpy." In the kitchen, she filled the kettle with water and set it on the stove. The familiar routine helped to steady her nerves, and she focused on the simple task, grateful for the distraction. As she waited for the water to boil, she heard a soft, rhythmic tapping. At first, she thought it was the rain, but then she realized it was coming from inside the house. The tapping was faint but persistent, echoing through the halls. It seemed to be coming from upstairs, from one of the rooms she hadn't explored yet. Her curiosity piqued. Melanie decided to investigate. She grabbed a flashlight from the drawer, feeling a bit silly for needing it but not wanting to rely on the flickering, unreliable light of the old house. She climbed the creaky staircase, the tapping growing louder with each step. It had a strange, almost hypnotic quality, drawing her toward its source. The hallway upstairs was dark and cold, the air thick with an unsettling stillness. Melanie followed the sound to a door at the end of the hall, one she hadn't opened since she moved in. Taking a deep breath, she turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room beyond was a small study, lined with dusty bookshelves and an old, ornate desk. The tapping sound was coming from the window where a tree branch was gently striking the glass in the wind. Melanie let out a relieved sigh, feeling foolish for being so easily spooked. She walked over to the window and moved the branch aside, securing it so it wouldn't tap against the glass anymore. As she turned to leave, something caught her eye. On the desk was an old leather-bound journal, its cover worn and faded. Intrigued, she picked it up and opened it, flipping through the yellowed pages. The journal belonged to her great-aunt Edna. It was filled with neat, precise handwriting, detailing her daily life, thoughts, and experiences. Melanie skimmed through the entries, fascinated by the glimpse into her aunt's world. But as she read on, the entries took a darker turn. Edna wrote about strange occurrences in the house, about feeling watched and hearing voices. She described vivid nightmares and a growing sense of dread that seemed to consume her. One entry in particular caught Melanie's attention. It was dated just a few days before Edna's death, June 15, 1987. "The presence is stronger now. I can feel it watching me, lurking in the shadows. It whispers to me, calling my name. I don't know what it wants, but I can sense its malevolence. I am afraid. I have tried to reach out for help, but no one believes me. They think I am just an old woman with a wild imagination. But I know the truth. There is something in this house, something dark and ancient. I fear it will not rest until it has claimed another soul." Melanie shivered, the words sending a chill down her spine. She closed the journal and set it back on the desk, her mind racing. Could it be possible that the house was truly haunted? She had always been a skeptic, but the eerie atmosphere, the strange noises, and now her aunt's journal were making her question everything. As she stood there and lost in thought, she heard a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. It was faint, like a breath of wind, but unmistakable. "Melanie." Her heart skipped a beat, and she felt a cold hand of fear grip her. She turned slowly, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The room was empty, but the whisper came again, more insistent this time. "Melanie." The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing in her mind. Panic surged through her, and she backed out of the room, her footsteps quickening as she hurried down the hallway. She had to get out of the house to escape whatever was haunting her. But as she reached the top of the stairs, the whispers grew louder, more urgent. "Melanie, don't leave. Stay with us." She stumbled down the stairs, nearly tripping in her haste. The whispers followed her, growing into a cacophony of voices, all calling her name. She reached the front door and fumbled with the lock, her hand shaking. Just as she managed to open the door, a powerful gust of wind slammed it shut, knocking her back. The voices were all around her now, a chorus of ghostly whispers that filled the air. "You cannot leave, Melanie. You belong to us." She backed away from the door, her mind racing. She had to find another way out. She ran to the living room, intending to escape through one of the windows, but as she reached for the latch, the window slammed shut with a force that rattled the glass. Trapped and terrified, Melanie turned to face the room. The shadows seemed to shift and move, coalescing into a dark, amorphous shape. The temperature dropped, and she could see her breath in the frigid air. The shape took form, becoming a tall, shadowy figure with hollow, glowing eyes. "Why do you run from us, Melanie?" The figure intoned, its voice a chilling blend of many voices speaking as one. "We have waited for you, join us." Melanie's mind reeled, and she struggled to comprehend what was happening. She could feel the darkness closing in, the malevolent presence overwhelming her senses. Desperation clawed at her, and she reached for the fireplace poker, brandishing it like a weapon. "Stay back," she cried, her voice trembling with fear. "Leave me alone." The figure seemed to laugh, a hollow, echoing sound that sent shivers down her spine. "You cannot fight us, Melanie. You are ours." As the figure advanced, Melanie swung the poker wildly, but it passed through the shadowy form with no effect. The darkness enveloped her, the voices growing louder, more insistent. She could feel herself being pulled into the abyss, her strength waning. In a final, desperate act, she closed her eyes and screamed, pouring all her fear and defiance into one primal cry. The sound echoed through the house, reverberating off the walls and shattering the oppressive silence. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the darkness receded. The voices fell silent, and the figure dissolved into the shadows. Melanie collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. She didn't know how long she lay there, but eventually, the storm outside began to subside. The wind died down, and the rain tapered off to a gentle drizzle. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Slowly, Melanie got to her feet, her mind still reeling from the ordeal. She looked around the room, half expecting the shadows to come to life again, but everything was as it should be. The fire in the hearth had died down to glowing embers, casting a faint, reassuring warmth. With shaky steps, she made her way to the kitchen and poured herself a cup of tea, her hand still trembling. She sat at the table, sipping the warm liquid and trying to make sense of what had happened. Had it all been a hallucination, a trick of her mind, or had she truly encountered something supernatural, something beyond her understanding? As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, Melanie knew one thing for certain: she could not stay in the house any longer. She had to leave to put as much distance between herself and the darkness that lurked within its walls. With renewed determination, she packed her belongings, moving quickly and efficiently. The house seemed to watch her as she worked, its silence heavy with unspoken threats. But she refused to be cowed, her resolve hardened by the night's events. By the time the sun had fully risen, Melanie was ready to leave. She took one last look around the old house, its once beautiful features now seeming sinister and foreboding. She stepped outside, breathing in the fresh, rain-washed air, and closed the door behind her. As she walked away, she could feel the weight lifting from her shoulders, the oppressive presence of the house fading with each step. She didn't know what the future held, but she was determined to face it on her own terms, free from the shadows of the past. And as she drove away, leaving the old house and its dark secrets behind, Melanie vowed never to return. She would start anew, somewhere far from the haunted memories that would forever linger in the echoes of the storm. It was a dark and stormy night, the kind where the wind howls through the trees and the rain lashes against the windows with a relentless fury. Johnson, a middle-aged man with a taste for solitude, was settled in his remote cabin deep in the woods. He enjoyed the quiet, the seclusion, and most of all, the chance to escape from the hustle and bustle of city life. On this particular night, Johnson sat by the fireplace, a mug of steaming coffee in hand, and a thick book on his lap. The crackling of the fire was the only sound inside the cabin, contrasting with the tumultuous weather outside. Every so often a flash of lightning would illuminate the room, casting eerie shadows on the walls. As he turned a page in his book, Johnson heard a faint tapping sound. He paused, straining to hear over the din of the storm. The tapping came again, this time more insistent. He dismissed it as a branch hitting the window and returned to his reading. Minutes later, the tapping grew louder, more deliberate. Johnson's curiosity got the better of him. He set his book aside and approached the window, squinting into the darkness beyond the glass. Another flash of lightning lit up the scene outside, revealing nothing but the wind-whipped trees. Then he saw it. For the briefest moment, illuminated by a jagged streak of lightning, a face appeared in the window, pale and gaunt, with eyes that seemed to bore into Johnson's soul. He stumbled back, his heart pounding. The face was gone as quickly as it had appeared, swallowed by the darkness. Johnson tried to calm himself. "Just my imagination," he muttered, but deep down he knew it was no illusion. He closed the curtains, blocking out the storm and whatever might be lurking outside. He checked the locks on the doors and windows, making sure they were secure. Then, with trembling hands, he picked up his book and tried to resume reading. The tapping started again, louder this time, and more persistent. It was as if someone or something was demanding entry. Johnson's nerves were frayed. He tried to ignore it, but the sound was unrelenting, echoing through the small cabin. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached the window once more. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice shaking. There was no response, only the relentless tapping. With a deep breath, Johnson flung open the curtains and shined his flashlight into the darkness. There, standing just outside the window, was a figure. It was tall and thin, with hollow eyes and a sinister grin that sent chills down Johnson's spine. The figure raised a skeletal hand and pointed directly at Johnson. "Let me in," it whispered, though its lips never moved. The voice was inside Johnson's head, cold and menacing. Panic surged through Johnson. He stumbled back, knocking over a chair. The flashlight slipped from his grasp, rolling across the floor and casting wild shadows on the walls. "Go away," Johnson screamed. "Leave me alone." The figure's grin widened, and the tapping turned into a deafening pounding. Johnson covered his ears, trying to block out the noise, but it was useless. The sound reverberated through his skull, drowning out all rational thought. Desperate, Johnson fled to the basement, slamming the door behind him. He huddled in the darkness, his mind racing. The pounding continued, echoing through the entire cabin. It seemed to be coming from everywhere, surrounding him, suffocating him. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. Time lost all meaning in the oppressive darkness. Finally, the pounding stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Johnson waited, hardly daring to breathe. Slowly, he crept back upstairs, flashlight in hand. The cabin was deathly quiet, the only sound the distant rumble of thunder. He approached the window, heart hammering in his chest. With trembling hands, he opened the curtains once more. The figure was gone. Johnson collapsed into a chair, his body shaking with relief and exhaustion. He didn't know what he had seen or what had happened, but he was grateful it was over, or so he thought. As he closed his eyes, trying to calm his racing heart, he heard a faint whisper, "I'm still here, Johnson, always watching." And in the reflection of the window, he saw the face once more, grinning maliciously, its hollow eyes staring into his soul. Rain lashed against the windows, the wind howling like a banshee. Kalina, huddled beneath a mountain of blankets, clutched a tattered copy of Ghost Stories, the only source of light in the room being a flickering candle. Every creak of the old house, every groan of the wind seemed amplified in the darkness. As she devoured the spooky tales, a prickling sensation danced down her spine. Kalina couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She glanced around the room, her heart hammering against her ribs. Shadows danced in the flickering candlelight, morphing into grotesque shapes that seemed to beckon her closer. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind slammed a window shut, rattling the entire house. Kalina yelped, her breath catching in her throat. She scrambled to get up, her legs weak with fear. As she fumbled for the matches to relight the forgotten fireplace, a soft moan echoed through the room. Kalina froze. The moan wasn't from the wind, it was from somewhere closer. Slowly, she turned her head, her eyes scanning the room. In the corner, by the dusty grandfather clock, a figure materialized from the shadows, tall and gaunt, with wispy white hair and eyes that glowed an eerie red. It stared at Kalina with a chilling intensity. Kalina's mind went blank. She wanted to scream, but no sound escaped her petrified lips. The figure took a shuffling step forward, its bony fingers brushing against the wall, leaving a trail of icy mist. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. Just as the figure lunged towards Kalina, a loud crash erupted from downstairs. In a heartbeat, the terrifying apparition vanished, the room plunging back into near darkness. Kalina, shaken to her core, stumbled towards the source of the sound, her legs shaky but her fear replaced by a surge of adrenaline. Holding her breath, she crept down the stairs, each step echoing in the eerie silence. As she reached the kitchen, she flicked on the light, revealing a mess of broken glass and spilled groceries. Relief washed over Kalina. It must have been a stray tree branch that crashed through the window, the noise startling both her and the figment of her overactive imagination. Exhausted but strangely exhilarated, Kalina cleaned up the mess. As she secured the broken window, she glanced back at the room where she had been reading. The shadow seemed less menacing now, the prickling sensation gone. Maybe, Kalina thought with a tired smile, scary stories were best left for sunny days.